Alright, so we are introducing the third part of our unexhaustive study of melodic black metal. And part three, it takes us into 1993. This is the first part of two that explores 1993 and its importance in terms of influencing the stuff outside of black metal, as well as the stuff within it that was being outright melodic, and the stuff that added to the vernacular of melodic black metal guitar playing, arrangement, aesthetics, and whatnot over time. There will be a lot of, I guess the Swedish scene here is going to really feature in 1993. There was a lot else going on. It's probably too much to cover, but we do see the emergence of Emperor in a serious way. We see Beharit showing up with their debut LP, and we've got Satiricon's first couple of albums, and bands like Carpathian Forest, which were important at the time. Well, we don't really talk about them as much outright as classics, but we've also got bands like Necrophobic, Marduk, Sentenced, Carcass. All these things that they contributed to black death metal. They contributed to melodic death metal. They contributed in a lot of different ways to what was going on at the time. But we're not ready to really talk about their music, or we might not at all for some of them, because they're not necessarily going to be relevant later, or there are other bands that cover just as well what they were doing. We don't necessarily need to mention the fact that death and roll was a thing. I'm not going to be covering the merger of melodic death metal and death and roll for any reason, and there isn't a lot of crossover with melodic black metal at all. We can excuse ourselves from popular music pretty quickly beyond 1993, but we should talk about melodic death metal and its allegiance with melodic black death metal, and how that blurred line was really important for establishing a lot of style in the Swedish scene in particular, as well as how that passed on and gave impressions to the rest of the world. This is really important to establish as we approach the German melodic black metal scene when it started, as well as various others that popped up in different ways. Particularly the United States as well, in the Midwest and other places. We are establishing context still. We're not fully diving into it, but we've introduced some bands that are pretty important. Beyond that point, we're not going to talk about Verathron just yet in depth, nor are we probably going to talk about Necromantia at all. But I did want to mention A Goddess, because that will take us to some relevant records later on, and introducing them here gives us some context for what they'll sound like later. And I felt like it was important to mention that, what else was going on in the United States. Black metal was different at the time. It was still a Black Death combination in 1993. There were bands like Grand Belial's Key that were introducing some melody into their sound. There were bands like Habohe and Absu and Blasphemy who were incorporating black death metal in their own ways, very important ways, all great records and great bands. But we're kind of trying to hone in on a certain type of sound here, so because there's going to be a lot of melodic black death metal that comes out in the next 3 or 4 years, and the precedence was really set within melodic black and death metal. So we'll get there. But first, there are a couple of records that I was not able to find, or demos I couldn't get to. Mortal Disciplines promo tape, the first one. I can still cover their 1995 LP, but I'd like to hear the promo tape. Pegasus is a band I've never actually heard. They're described as black heavy metal. I believe they're German, and When Darkness Begins is just not out there. They were eventually a power metal band, so it's probably not that important to follow up on it. But otherwise, Miscreants demo tape Ashes, I just don't have access to it. I think it was packaged in with Dreaming in Ice at one point. I'm not sure if that record has ever been reissued. I think it was on Wrong Again Records, Dreaming in Ice. I don't quite remember. Otherwise, we're going to start with Sacramentum's first demo. I think a very important band to be talking about in terms of what a lot of people think of when they think of Swedish melodic black death metal or Swedish melodic black metal, and where a lot of the more serious the side of it started out. And I think that we definitely hear some of the remnants of their beginnings as a death metal band, but we also hear there was always black metal influences here, and it makes sense. They were friends with the guys in Decameron. They make their way into their liner notes here on the tape, because both bands were developing in a similar way, but still technically playing death metal. There's a bit of Bathory in there too, but as we listen to a clip of this tape, it's important to notice that this band was always pretty sophisticated. We can't say they were ever just crapping out a shitty tape. This is a pretty solid tape. I believe it's been reissued on I think a 7-inch by Dementia Records more recently. Definitely worth getting, and everything by this band is absolute class. It's one of my favorites. So the inclusion of Ancient Ceremonies first tape is more for this having a conversation about what is Gothic death doom metal, what is considered Gothic black metal, and what was basically just Gothic metal, as well as black death metal. So this tape is kind of a conversation between Gothic metal trends, but also a band that had probably developed as a black death metal band to begin. And so we kind of see the influence from Paradise Lost's second album coming in and changing the flavor of their music dramatically. This band is pretty interesting. It's a cool thing to know about because they were sued by the Catholic Church in 2004 very unfairly, and it kind of ended their career in a lot of ways. But just knowing this tape, it's got some cool moments, especially if you're just interested in Gothic death metal of the time, like Crematory and whatnot on the German side of things. Otherwise, kind of bad Gothic metal in a lot of ways and might not interest most people. But I thought this was something that's always been included in the Melodic Black Death Metal list of early demos, which I've never quite agreed with. But it's interesting trivia and gives us some context of kind of the far reaches of how a band like Paradise Lost influenced so many groups and how dark metal kind of became a thing more and more over time, and in that sense. So here, in the Forest of the Dreaming Dead, we get the not only an early No Fashion release, an interesting one, but also an animated's first attempt at a full-length album, one that was very much rooted in the death metal of the time, something that was probably conscious of at least at the Gates' first record, but and probably styled itself a little bit after that in some ways. But that didn't mean that there was no black metal influence here. If anything, they'd probably been fans of Carcass, they'd probably been fans of At the Gates, but they'd been developing their own sound. I would say along this line since 1991 when that first demo tape hit, or the first official one. We see those songs fully developed here. We do see a clear influence from Bathory and stuff like that. I think we see influence from Merciless in here too. If you compare this record with Unbound from Merciless, I think there's a lot of correlations we can draw in some aspects in terms of the Bathory influence. Otherwise, this is a very interesting and unique melodic death metal record, which has some black metal influence. I think it's viably a melodic black death metal record in one of the earliest ones in some sense, but also there's a lot of reasons and good reasons why this wasn't received all that well or wasn't all that popular at the time. I don't think those reasons hold up anymore, but the main one is that the production was different. It was kind of flat, it was tinny, and wasn't what death metal fans wanted at the time. And you see endless complaining about the recording quality of it and all that, but I think it's pretty unique. It sounds like nothing else at the time, and this was a pretty sophisticated band for how quickly they developed. You know, history has sort of cleansed its bad record on taking note of this great record. It has been reissued, and Century Media has done a really great job of reviving the record with proper album art and all that, and they've remastered it to the point where it is, well, it loses some of its context in time. And while I do usually hate remasters, and I would prefer the original sound, it does sound quite good, and I do own the remastered version of it on vinyl. I think it's appropriate, but for our context, if you can get a hold of the original mix of this record, the original No Fashion release, which of course is a difficult thing to do, that context is really important for placing it in the canon of melodic death metal, because it just wasn't quite up to par with what people wanted at the time. It wasn't as heavy as other things. It was different, and nowadays I can look back and say this is a great record for 1993. It was a great way to start 1993 as a February release, and so for me, this is an important record, and I think their second record is even more important to our sort of discussion here on melodic black metal. But we'll get there when we do. But give this one a chance. I'm going to say that about a couple of records in 1993. I think this is one of the more important ones because it came earlier and it set the tone for what would happen throughout the year in this respect. So we have a little bit of an oddball from Finland. This is a Finnish gothic metal band which featured members of Black Crucifixion. Now this takes on a style that's probably closer to something like Ophthalmia or even Thy Serpent, where it's a little bit of almost a symphonic gothic black doom metal sound, and one that was nothing like what they would produce after this. This is just an early 7-inch, which features a fairly melodic symphonic style, and later on they would become a gothic metal band. I think it's a good way to introduce kind of the Finnish sound a little bit. It doesn't quite get us there altogether, and there aren't a lot of death metal remnants to really show off here, but it is a tuneful and strong enough sounding record that it's worth it as an interesting curio to check out. So, of course, Eucharist's debut full-length album, A Velvet Creation, was not a black metal record. They said as much at the time. There were certainly black metal influences infused into their sound from the beginning, but as Daniel Erlandsson put it back in 1992, no, they weren't a black metal band at all. But that doesn't mean that this wasn't an important record for melodic black death metal going forward. They really did set the standard for voicing, for riffcraft, the style of techniques that work together, the technical sort of interplay between the two guitars and the drummer, and the layering and songwriting on this thing was so well finessed, but still kind of rawly death metal at the same time. It was still raw and death metal at the time. This is a really important record to me, especially as it introduced melodic death metal to me, but also it has a character that's unlike anything else. And to the point where I will make more points about remasters. This should never have been remastered. It really deserves its original sound and the context to which it arrived. And you'll see why not a lot of people talked about Eucharist once At the Gates became a melodic death metal band, because, well, that was more of a rock-oriented thing. This was a more complex and convoluted pathway, and also it had kind of bad production values for its time. Much like Unanimated, they presented this in a fairly raw and inexperienced setting, and it just didn't sound as good. Now, looking back, it's got its own personality, and the original sound is very integral to the way that things interplay, the way that things move together. The remaster might give us the bass tone and things like that and clarify the drums a bit. It all sounds a little bit better. The drums still sound fake. This is still the original sound to me just really gets the point across a lot better. It takes me back to that time and place, and I think that we're going to find that this is one of the more influential bands in terms of composition and general technical interplay between elements as we develop the Swedish melodic black death metal sound and the way that black metal was eventually incorporated in it. I think also the vocalist is exceptional on this record. I think that the drummer was pretty sharp for what he was doing, and there are raw aspects of it, but that give it all the more character. I think black metal fans especially will be able to appreciate the cold pallor of this record and the way that it expresses itself. It's a very emotional and sophisticated record, which I think has always taken kind of a back seat to a lot of the more popular things that came after it. But you couldn't get me to listen to an In Flames record ever after once I'd heard this, because it was just so clearly a better thing and a more sincere thing. So obviously I'm a huge fan of this, but I would just encourage people to pay attention to all of the things that Eucharist brings to the language of melodic death metal and how that translated to a lot of melodic black metal bands later on. So essentially what Agatis do on their two full-length albums and this demo is they incorporate some admiration of Bathory in terms of creating an epic black metal experience, as well as incorporating heavy metal into their sound. And that involves some keyboards, the stature of Bathory essentially infusing into their sound, which was more related to the Molin Lave Studio sound. This was an earlier release from that output. And also, we get something I guess I would associate with a band like Ancient from Norway, where that keyboard infused sound still has heavy metal riffs behind it. So we'll talk about that band a little bit later. But I'd like to introduce that parody between the two bands because they both present something which was equally interesting. Uh, so this is kind of a side note for now, a way to introduce this band, but they'll become a little bit more of a discussion later on with their first two full-length albums in the 90s. So North from Here is sort of the bastard child of melodic death metal. It's the one thing that people don't talk about very often. It's also an interesting technical death metal record as much as it is a melodic black death metal record. And I think it's important to provide the context of my experience at the time. I think I was about 10 or 11 years old at the time reading magazines. And when I happened upon North from Here, I had to hear it because it was so hyped by everyone who wrote about it as this new thing, this new transcendent voice that merges the Scandinavian sound with the kind of the sound of Atheist. They really were influenced by early Atheist on this record, and there are some direct parallels drawn between Moments on Unquestionable Presence and North from Here. But there's also a little bit of what you'd find in the technique and austerity of Dissection later on in the year that you'll hear on this record as well. It's sort of it's always been its own thing, so it's not necessarily always included in discussions of melodic death metal or melodic black metal or anything in between, even though there's quite a lot of Bathory influence on this record, and they pointed out themselves. Now, do they mention Primus too in the same sentence? Is there a lot of weird influences that went into the same thing? Yes, but I think that's what made Sentence interesting early on when they were trying their hardest before they became a gothic metal band. So this is it in terms of when the chance to talk about when Sentence was most relevant and interesting to someone who's interested in underground death metal or black metal in some sense. But the fact that this was a black metal influenced melodic death metal record makes it uniquely interesting to this discussion because we find a lot of bands were heavily influenced by North from Here, and they would end up playing melodic black death metal, but that will take a while to show up. People who outright point to this record as influence probably won't show up until we're closer to the millennium, with a couple of outliers that are more maybe technical death metal oriented. So to round things out, we're going to introduce Lord Blasphemate. This is a Brazilian black metal group who were primarily influenced by the classics of early, like late 80s black metal like Venom and whatnot, as well as Rotting Christ. I think that this opens up a discussion more of what was going on in South America at the time, what was going on in Brazil at the time, and how the scene had exaggerated and expanded beyond the breakout of bands like Sarcophago and Sepultura. As we reach for groups that are a little bit more obscure like Genocidio, Amen Corner, and whatnot, we do find doom and gothic metal entering into the vernacular, but there are just a few pretty great bands that had heavy influence from Rotting Christ. I believe Mystifier would be counted in there, and I think they traded a lot of influence back and forth. Rotting Christ's influence on Lord Blasphemate is more obvious on their 1997 full length. It's obviously made pretty clear here as they've covered the Old Coffin Spirit on this demo tape along with a song from Venom. So this is a really rough, hard to listen to tape. It goes on for I think an hour and 7 minutes. It sounds terrible, but it's the first reasonable way that we can experience Lord Blasphemate's sound and see how it would change course over the next 4 or so years before they kind of dropped off the face of the earth. So an obscurity, but also an introduction to what South America was doing, and that they were touched by the greater zeitgeist of black metal and how it translated in different ways. So this is only the first half. We've been going in fairly chronological order. We've gotten to maybe the summer here, and we're going to finish out 1993 on part 4 as we do start to talk about popular melodic black metal bands and their most nascent stages as underground death metal bands. And that's kind of par for the course so far, but we will kind of hit upon the point here of discussing 1993 in so much depth, and this is going to become really important context for 1994 as we really get into the thick of things. So stay tuned for that.